Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the CYBERUK ransomware webinar for schools and the education sector. Technology continues to move at a dazzling pace, and while it can transform the way that we live and work for the better, it's not without its risks. I'm sure that everyone here has received plenty of spam in their in-tray or been invited to send their financial details to some dubious outfit. We're all getting wiser to these scams, but cyber criminals are getting cleverer too. Cybersecurity threats are very real, and the damage they can cause is huge. The education sector is just as vulnerable as any other sector. So I'd like to thank the National Cybersecurity Centre for organising this webinar, and I hope it will go a long way to keeping our schools safe. As you may know, during the pandemic, we have seen two periods where the education sector has been subjected to increased targeting by ransomware. And during this time, we have had over 70 ransomware cases, as well as more from across higher and further education. Not only does this threaten children's education, it can be really frightening for schools and can distract teachers from doing their jobs. Whenever we hear about any cyber attacks on schools, we work closely with the National Cybersecurity Centre and the police to help those affected. Obviously, we want any school that experiences a cyber attack to report them immediately. But we want to make sure that schools know how to build up their defences to prevent cyber attacks happening in the first place. As Schools Minister, I want to help schools to be proactive and on the front foot to improve their cyber resilience. We're developing a tool for schools to measure their own levels of cybersecurity, and this will provide valuable signposting to a range of advice and guidance that schools can use to make positive changes to their technology environments. We expect to launch this early next year, and I'd urge everyone to take advantage of it. Cyber attacks are crimes, and we can't afford to let our schools or our children be the victims of such crimes. I hope you find today's webinar useful in your role of keeping our schools cyber secure. And I look forward to working with you to ensure that schools and colleges remain safe and secure places for education. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Paul Maddinson. I'm Director for National Resilience and Strategy in the NCSC. Welcome to today's ransomware webinar for the school and education sector. Cybersecurity has never been more important to the education sector than it is now. The recent spate of ransomware attacks against schools, colleges and universities have demonstrated why it's so important to prepare and test your cyber defences. We have designed today's session to help you do this. We will begin with a general ransomware overview, which will cover what ransomware is and how it is deployed. The session will then look at how you can back up your data properly. The final presentation will describe how ransomware can enter and spread across the school's network, leading to a significant cyber security incident. You will hear firsthand from one of our incident management handlers. We will finish with a panel discussion with partners from across the education sector, including the Department for Education. Throughout the session, we will be answering your questions live on our CyberUK Twitter channel. Please tweet us with your questions using the hashtag CyberUK21. I hope you find today's session useful. Please look out for further school cybersecurity resources at the end of today's session.
Hello, I'm Gregory H., an Engagement Officer at the National Cybersecurity Centre. Today, I'll be talking to you about ransomware, giving you a brief overview of the following questions. What is ransomware? How has ransomware developed? How does a ransomware attack work? And how can we defend against a ransomware attack? Let's start at the beginning. What is ransomware? Ransomware is a type of malware that prevents victims from accessing data on their devices. Once infected, victims usually receive a ransom demand for payment and for the recovery of their data. This will usually be in the form of Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency. Once the ransom has been paid, the attacker will provide a decryption key to allow access to the data once more. In larger networks, some ransomwares can spread laterally like a virus to infect connected devices. Next, let's look at how ransomware has developed in recent years. When ransomware first appeared, consumers were targeted with mass spray and pray attacks. Ransomware was distributed in a scattergun approach, aimed at many targets through use of phishing with malicious attachments. While requiring minimal human intervention, this typically resulted in very few ransom payouts. These were paid with traditional currency electronically, or by premium rate SMS numbers, or sending checks to addresses in Panama or other such locations. These methods were all vulnerable to law enforcement, so cryptocurrency is now the preferred method for payment. Indeed, by 2019 April, 98% of payments were made by Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency. In recent years, the modus operandi for ransomware attacks has changed and now tends towards what is referred to as big game hunting. These attacks are more targeted, demand bigger ransoms, and are aimed at organizations instead of individuals, for the simple reason that it's easier to extract a large ransom from an organization or a corporate victim compared to an individual. Ransomware actors are increasingly sophisticated and will investigate their target beforehand to understand their business critical systems and data, ability to pay, and backups, the latter of which might reduce their willingness to pay. Microsoft calls this human-operated ransomware. During 2020, while investigating targeted networks, NCSC has increasingly seen criminals looking for sensitive data that the victim would not want to be made public, contract negotiations, staff salaries, and so forth. This data is extracted before the ransomware payload is detonated, and the criminals then threaten to leak the sensitive information unless the ransom is paid. These data theft and extortion tactics are very effective at increasing pressure on businesses to pay the ransom. The groups often have a data leak site to allow targets to confirm the attackers have valuable data. This two-pronged trend to extort means victims are at risk even if they have backed up their data. A demand for the ransom decryption key to recover encrypted files, and a ransom demand to stop the release of the data that has been stolen during the attack. However, even if the ransom is paid, there is no guarantee that the decryption key will be provided for the files, or that the criminal will not leak the sensitive information anyway. Paying the ransom can lead also to repeat incidents, as victims who pay risk being seen as soft targets. We've also seen that these targets can be hit by a second attack some months later. Ransomware is likely to feature very prominently in NCSC's 2020 report. Ransomware is a very profitable crime. Revell reported profits of $100 million in 2019 and should not be expected to decrease. Revell are but one of a number of active ransomware groups. NCSC also expects incidents to increase due to the rise of ransomware as a service. It was first observed in 2015 and gives less skilled actors the tools to conduct their own attacks. This has encouraged the growth of the ransomware industry by lowering the barriers to entry and made it much more difficult to successfully attribute attackers to groups. Data suggests that the UK is not the most heavily targeted country compared with similar economies, possibly because traditionally British victims are less likely to pay the ransom. However, the trends also suggest that ransomware attacks will continue to increase, and many UK businesses will be exposed nonetheless. Next, let's look at how a generalized human-operated ransomware attack works. On the left, we have a sample network comprised of desktops, servers, and file backups. On the right, we have our attacker who will attempt to leverage a vulnerability in the network to gain control. Before 2020, the primary vehicle for infection was via phishing email, with macro-enabled Excel spreadsheets downloading malware into networks. Today, it's more likely to be an exposed remote access terminal like RDP or a Citrix gateway, primarily due to the massive increase in home working in the pandemic, where new solutions have been implemented in a potentially unsecure way, or where existing systems have had their security features loosened to manage increased demand from users. However, the latter steps remain mostly the same. Once the attacker has a foothold in the network, they can then leverage that vulnerability to install a backdoor on the system. There's a huge variety of tools like this, like TripBot, Cobalt Strike, Dridex, and many others, including some which are more traditionally considered penetration testing tools, having been repurposed by attackers. Once the foothold has been secured, the attacker still really only has control of one device. If the attacker triggers the ransomware payload now, the organization can ignore it without much loss of business continuity, probably by wiping and re-imaging that device. So, the attacker needs to increase their presence in the environment. Most often, the attacker will do this by scraping credentials with tools like Mimikatz and using them to access other devices to attempt to escalate their privilege. Mimikatz, for example, accesses credentials stored in memory, which gives the attacker something to start with, but it's a user account, not an administrator, so they repeat the process until they find an account with more privileges, like a network or workstation administrator. While the actor is acting maliciously, so far they will have done little to trigger any SIEM or SOC monitoring solutions. They're just using inbuilt services that allow movement within the network. Once they've got some credentials with more privileges, they can then start to move on to servers and other network infrastructure until they find the golden key, the domain administrator account, with which they can log into the domain controller. As soon as the attacker has control of the domain controller, the network is effectively lost and will need to be rebuilt from the ground up. The attacker can now create new accounts, repurpose existing accounts, and reinforce their presence in the environment. The attacker is now fundamentally the network administrator. They might also install additional backups to allow further access, or to regain control if they are caught mid-operation. Previously, attackers would detonate the payload now, but as aforementioned, we're seeing that at this stage, attackers are also scraping the network for valuable information with which to extort the victim. This data is then exfiltrated, as discussed before. Closing in on the prize, they now delete the backups and file servers which you might have recovered data from. This increases the pressure on the business to pay the ransom and damages their business continuity efforts. Finally, the attacker deploys the ransomware. Remember, they're the network administrator at this point and can use distribution tools like SCCM to deploy it like an update to all devices on the domain. And then the ransom note is delivered. All attacks vary in strains and tools used, but overall, this is the most common methodology for a ransomware attack. Find an initial foothold in a network, scrape credentials to move laterally till a privilege escalation to an administrative account can access the domain controller, and then deploy the ransomware. So, how can you mitigate it against an attack of this type? Let's have a look at some common measures you can take to defend against a ransomware attack. Please remember this is general advice. Your organization's network and business posture will have many complexities to consider when implementing network security. Consider implementing a Security Information and Events Management System, SIEM for short, to allow you to monitor your network for unusual or malicious activity. By using an antivirus or host-based intrusion detection system, you can detect the installation of tools like Mimikatz before the attacker has a chance to gain a foothold on your network and to take appropriate action to prevent further activity. Similarly, if the attacker tries to deploy malware, the antivirus will hopefully prevent its execution unless disabled by the attacker, another hurdle for them to overcome. By carefully controlling account privileges, you can prevent the attacker from moving between devices, even if they do manage to scrape the credentials for one user. Likewise, if you can detect unusual activity, like users logging in devices they've never used before, you can intervene before matters worsen. By preventing any unauthorized applications from running, you hinder efforts for the attacker to gain a foothold in the environment. Like account management, by separating administrative and standard accounts, you can help to prevent privilege escalation. As we mentioned, if the domain controller is compromised, it is very difficult to retain control of the network. The smallest subset of users possible should have access to your domain controller, and all users with any access should be subject to extra security controls, such as multi-factor authentication. Our demonstration showed that attackers will be actively targeting your online backups, and that the loss of these can severely hamper your recovery effort. Consider using offline backups, so you've always got something to fall back on. And finally, make plans for the failure of the rest of your plans. There's always a chance that you will have missed something, or a zero-day exploit will render your efforts ineffectual. You can use NCSE's free Exercise in a Box tool to help rehearse your business continuity plans. For greater detail on all of these topics, please visit our website, www.ncse.gov.uk. You can also find us online at Twitter and at LinkedIn. At this point, I'll hand over to Hannah.
In this part of the session, we'll explain more about backing up effectively. Having an effective backup solution in place is a key measure that can help you recover from a ransomware attack, and it should be a major component of a comprehensive ransomware mitigation strategy. Regardless of size, all organisations should take regular backups of their important data, as well as ensuring these backups are recent and can be restored. This means that you would still be able to function following an incident, whether or not it's cyber-related. Data loss can occur for a number of reasons, including mundane ones, such as accidental deletion by a user. And when it comes to ransomware, often the first indication that a victim has suffered an attack is when they can no longer access their systems. This leaves them with little choice but to recover from their backups. However, if the backups have been encrypted or formatted by the attacker, as they often are, then effective recovery is much more difficult. So what do you need to do when considering a backup solution? First, you should identify what data you need to back up. Not all data is equal. Some will be more important. You need to think about the range of data you hold and prioritise it. This diagram shows two dimensions you might want to consider: the confidence you need to have in your data and the impact of not being able to access it. Questions you might consider include: is the data particularly sensitive or time critical? Does your operation depend on it being available to function? Bear in mind that the impact of data being unavailable may change over time. Perhaps the impact of, say, attendance records being unavailable for an hour is negligible, but if this were to continue for a day or a week, then it would become much more problematic. And some data has more importance at particular times of the week, month, or year. For example, not being able to access learning resources will have much more impact on students shortly before coursework needs submitting or during exam season. Any backup solution needs to balance confidence in the ability to recover with the speed of recovery. You also need to factor in cost and ease. This should all shape the way you plan your backups. This diagram shows a traditional approach to backups. Typically, some form of sync storage is used, and at scheduled times, the data is copied to a storage array tape, USB mass storage, or a cloud service. This process is typically automated with different backup types scheduled to occur at different times. For example, a full backup to tape may be scheduled for the end of the working week, allowing time for this to complete before people return to work, whereas a series of incremental backups using a cloud service may occur in near real time. However, traditional backups, like we've just seen, aren't enough to protect you in the event of a ransomware attack. This is because your attacker will typically deploy ransomware after they've gained access to your IT systems. This means they will have access to any backups that are physically or logically connected to your IT systems as well. This is why ransomware often encrypts the original data and also the connected USB storage, network storage drives, or disk or tape-based servers that hold your backups. And this makes recovery far more difficult and increases the likelihood that the ransom will be paid. You'll see here that we've linked to two blogs on our website that we recommend you take a look at for more details: offline backups in an online world and cloud backup options for mitigating the threat of ransomware. So we recommend having an offline backup as part of your backup solution. In other words, a backup that's not connected to your IT systems, such as USB storage or a tape which has been physically removed from the drive or library. Ideally, an online backup will be located at a different site or building too, so that it's still available in the event of an on-site incident such as fire, flood, or theft. But it may not always be possible to physically disconnect your backup because of the timing of scheduled jobs or lack of IT admin, and so on. In this case, to reduce the risk of the attacker encrypting your backups, you could use write once, read many drives, or as they're often called, worm drives. CDR and DVD-R are common examples of these, as well as USB flash drives with write protection switches. These provide nearly as much confidence as physically disconnecting your backup. And some cloud services can be set up to keep historical copies of data for version control as a form of worm media. In the event of a ransomware attack, these copies could be used to revert to a previous version of your backup, one that is not encrypted or corrupted. The key message here is that although not all of your backups need to be offline, at least one should be at any given time, so that an incident cannot affect all your backups simultaneously. So we've heard how only an offline backup will provide you with absolute confidence that it won't be affected by a ransomware attack and provide you with very high levels of confidence in your ability to recover. That said, this recovery process is unlikely to be quick, especially if the backup is stored at a different site or building. This is where sync storage, which is logically or physically connected to your IT systems, comes in. Sync storage will likely form a part of your overall backup solution and provides relative speed and ease of recovery for day-to-day incidents. So when developing a backup solution, adopt the 3-2-1 rule, at least 3 copies in 2 locations, including one off-site. For example, you can incrementally back up in near real time using a logical connection to a cloud service, such as OneDrive or Google Drive, and use a physically connected USB mass storage, as well as a full offline tape backup, which are stored away from the site. The 3-2-1 approach will provide you with confidence in the ability to recover, as well as your ability to recover quickly. And remember, backups don't have to be completely digital either. It's entirely valid to print really crucial information off as a backup. This is all about being confident that your most critical data is safe from a localized incident. A backup solution which has adopted the 3-2-1 rule is great in theory and even better in practice. This means that backup solutions also need to be tested as part of your incident response and disaster recovery planning. Testing not only provides you with the confidence that you can recover, it also speeds up future recovery processes, as you would have already answered important questions such as, where is the data and how quickly can it be retrieved? Are the backups uncorrupted? Did the scheduled backup job complete properly? Do the backups contain everything you assumed was on them? When testing, you should ensure that at least one other backup is still offline. For example, a USB storage drive is physically disconnected while testing restoration from a cloud backup. If you want further confidence in your ability to recover, you could use more than one offline backup. Ideally, you should rotate offline backups so that at least one is always physically disconnected from your IT systems. Remember, this can be your last line of defense against a ransomware attack. It's also important to ensure that backups are only connected to known clean devices before starting recovery, and to scan backups for malware before you restore files. Ransomware may have infiltrated your network over a period of time and replicated to backups before being discovered. Finally, it's important to regularly patch products used as backups, so attackers cannot exploit any known vulnerabilities that they may contain. And the key message here is to test recovering data from backups, so you're not doing it for the first time during an incident and when you're under pressure. You've adopted the 3-2-1 rule, great, but all of this good work could be undermined if the backups themselves are not created on a regular basis. After all, an offline backup is unlikely to be much use if it has been gathering dust off-site somewhere for months. As discussed at the beginning of this section, when developing a backup solution, you need to consider the impact of your data being unavailable. This impact analysis will help you then decide the frequency and types of backups you need. The regular rule also applies to testing. It's important to test recovering your data from backups, But this needs to be done frequently as things can and often do change. The way in which you recovered from a backup 6 months ago may not be the same today because people, processes, or IT systems you rely on may have changed. So the key message here is that a fresh backup will get you up and running faster after an incident. Hopefully you'll never suffer a ransomware attack, but no one can guarantee it. That said, if you are affected by one, having followed these 4 rules will help you recover confidently and quickly. First, the offline rule, which means that at least one of your backups should not be physically connected to your IT systems. Second, the 3-2-1 rule. Have at least 3 copies in 2 locations, including one offsite, and rotate your offline backups. 3, the recovery rule. Test that you can recover from your backups. And 4th, the regular rule. Create and test your backups on a regular basis.
Hello, my name is Dan and I work in the incident management team here at the NCSE. I've been asked to briefly talk to you about when things go wrong for an organisation, and I'd like to briefly run through a scenario that depicts a common ransomware incident at an organisation. Imagine you're the head of an IT in an academic organisation. It's 9 o'clock on Saturday morning after a busy week. You're just getting ready to start the weekend, but just noticed a message pop up on your phone. Hey Julia, not sure what's happening, but for some reason I can't access the remote access today. Do you know about any problems? And then a further message a few moments later. Oh, that's weird. The website appears down too. You instruct the team to investigate, but they were unable to work it out and have asked to go on site. You arrange with a caretaker and send them in. You also travel in, as it seems like quite a big issue. Maybe it's a power outage. Half an hour later, you arrive on site with your team and log onto your computer, and you're presented with something like this. It now sinks in. You've seen pictures of these before. You've been hit by ransomware. This scenario is quite typical of how ransomware events that we support start. Weekends are a prime time for ransomware actors to do their work because they know you're at the office, so they've got more time to encrypt your data before you notice anything wrong. So what happens next? In reality, many organizations that we work with don't have effective plans in place to handle the early stages of a ransomware attack. What should they do? How should they contain and limit the damage of what has occurred? On a few incidents that I've worked on, the organization have simply pulled the power to the data center. It can't get any worse if everything's turned off right. However, yanking the power may damage the systems in other ways, and we've seen that happen too. Typically, what follows is then a process which sometimes takes several days to come to terms with what's happened. Processes to enable the finances needed to get a cyber incident response company on board and to buy new equipment may be difficult if you've got no IT at all. Who can you talk to? Who should you get the advice from? Should you report it to the ICO? Who's going to tell the head of your organization that your schools may not be open on Monday? Who is going to have that conversation with DFE? Does your organization have the capability to handle or understand a complex cyber attack? What about communications to your parents, to your staff, and to the media? A school not opening due to IT issues will no doubt grab media attention. They will phone you up. What will you say to them? So now what? You work out which questions you need to answer, but does any of that actually help you get your business back operational again? You've heard about backups. They're absolutely critical to the recovery. Here are some of the experiences of the data loss I've witnessed in responses that I've been involved in for some educational organizations. Loss of months of coursework on all of our students' home drives as our offline backups weren't working. All of our finance records, our parent contact details, enrollment data, and historical HR records, and many more. What would be the impact to your organization if you lost this type of data permanently? Have you ever thought about that? More recently, we've also been seeing some ransomware actors further extorting organizations by stealing data and then claiming to release it if the ransom is not paid. This adds a further twist, as not only do you have to recover your systems, but you also have to deal with this threat too. What if this is data about vulnerable children or staff HR records? So this all sounds quite scary, and it can be. You really don't want to have this experience unfold in your organization. Are you prepared for a ransomware event? If not, why not? What would you do if this happened to you? Just a quote from the NCC annual review in 2020. In 2020, we handled more than 3 times as many ransomware incidents than the previous year. And so far in 2021, that trend has not slowed down. Search for NCSE mitigating malware and ransomware in your favorite search engine for more information on how to protect yourself against ransomware attacks and what to do in the unfortunate circumstances that you have one. Thank you very much.
We now have a chance to hear from a panel of experts who have been on the front line trying to prevent ransomware attacks against schools. Joining us today, we have John Gilbert, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for the Department for Education. We have Heather Toomey, Cybersecurity Lead at the Education Data Hub in Derbyshire County Council, and Steve Forbes, who's Head of Cyber Product at Nominet. We've just heard about the threat of ransomware in school and education settings. Why else should schools prioritise cybersecurity, particularly with all the competing demands on their time and resources? Steve, what do you think?
Well, I think technology now plays a key part in almost every aspect of the running of a school, whether it be the signing in at the front desk, their management information systems, all their pupil data, their finances, or even in the classroom itself. Loss of access to those critical systems can have all manner of implications, including the students losing their work that's critical for their qualifications, right through to safeguarding issues if school staff can't access critical data about the students. You can't get away from the fact that technology is now absolutely critical to the way a school is run, and any loss of that technology can have really serious consequences. We've seen examples of schools not being able to open when their technology hasn't been operational, and whilst the day-to-day teaching of pupils isn't always reliant on technology 100% of the time, unless they're remote learning, of course, the actual operational running of a school is underpinned by that technology. Loss of access to those systems can cause considerable disruption, so putting good cybersecurity practices in place is absolutely essential. And it's not just about protecting the school from malicious attackers and ransomware. It also helps prevent accidental cybersecurity incidents as well, like loss of data or data breaches, and protect the school from things such as fraud as well, where they're particularly at risk due to the nature of having specific individuals in the school with broad control of finances and systems. So I think it's just an all-round good cybersecurity will help the schools against this particular issue, but the wider issues as well.
Thank you. And John, what do you think?
Following on from Steve's points there, it's really important to note that the digital estate of schools and other educational establishments is not just limited to those educational services, but will often support many other operational areas as well. And it could be, as Steve's mentioned, that probably does extend to things like door entry systems and physical security issues around CCTV, heating systems, but also the payment systems and back office services. And these are all so frequently all interconnected to one degree or another. An incident in one part of the estate would have wide-reaching consequences for the whole. But additionally to that, we collectively and as individual establishments hold large quantities of data on learners and those in our care to support learning and safeguarding needs. This will include sensitive data, and as a duty of care and as a duty of due diligence needed on the part of every organisation to ensure that we provide a safe learning environment. And security really can't be an afterthought in these occasions.
Absolutely. And Heather?
Yeah, definitely reflecting what John has just said. I think schools have found that with remote and blended learning, there's been a challenge and they've felt very vulnerable. They've rushed to provision systems that they perhaps didn't have full understanding of. They've ended up with speedy procurement in order to provide access to devices for vulnerable pupils. And that has come at a cost in some instances. That has affected the data protection by design principles, the security principles. And it's not just asking as a school, how useful is the system that we want to buy or use, but actually how secure is it and what do we know about the system and the data transference. We tend to find that sometimes schools act like lemmings. They sort of think, well, so-and-so down the road or that academy across town, they're all doing it. We'll use the same system, and that's not due diligence. Statistics show There's something like Cyber Essentials costs less than 1% of the average school spend on ed tech, on the technology that's in the classrooms across the school. So I think it's not really just about asking, can we afford cybersecurity, but actually, realistically, can we afford not to have cybersecurity? And the answer is emphatically, no, you can't.
Absolutely. So we've looked at today in one of the earlier sessions about backups and how that's a key measure to prepare for potential ransomware attack. But what are the other technical cybersecurity controls that you would recommend schools be using to reduce the likelihood or impact of cybersecurity attacks? Steve.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think before schools start thinking about investing in new cybersecurity products, it's important just to get the basics right. Otherwise, any money they spend on those products is just wasted. It's the equivalent of buying a flashy new security system for your house and leaving your doors unlocked. The NTSC's 10-step cybersecurity give a great starting point for any organisation, and that includes schools and education settings. Schools shouldn't think that just because it was designed for a kind of a broader audience, it doesn't include themselves in terms of that advice. Some of the steps do talk about implementing basic cybersecurity products like network security, anti-malware, but you may find that these solutions are already available to you. You might already have those either through your technology partners or through your ISP or perhaps your IT support provider. So it's important to check to see what you've already got before you go and spend money on new systems. The other aspects of the 10 steps focus on controls you can put in place to reduce that risk. That includes securely configuring those devices, restricting the user's access so they can only do the things you want them to be able to do, not install malicious applications and things like that, and make sure they only got access to the data they really need access to, as well as implementing the policies to monitor the use of those systems and those networks. There's lots of things, if you follow that advice, the basics that you can do before you start implementing additional cybersecurity products. And lastly, don't underestimate the impact of that user education. So educating your users in terms of what to look out for and how to protect themselves will go an awful long way, even further beyond those technical cybersecurity protections.
Thank you. And Heather, what do you think from your perspective?
I think, absolutely echo that with the 10 steps. And those 10 steps overlap with the requirements of Cyber Essentials. And that's something that I do think schools need to engage with. So the Cyber Essentials certification, the 5 key controls within that actually prevent up to 80% of unsophisticated cyber attacks. That's a huge number. It covers really basics, right, from your firewalls and internet gateways at your network perimeter, secure configurations, making sure that you've changed default passwords, making sure that you're very sure of what applications you're permitting in school that are loud lists, but also making sure you get rid of legacy applications and that old, out-of-date apps are removed. Malware and antivirus, and as we heard previously, a lot of schools are being sold products or they're being approached by marketing companies. Just really think about what you've got access to on your devices and make sure that it's updating appropriately. And if you've been sold some fancy dashboard or some report, lots of schools get drawn into that sales pitch. Just ask yourself who will be looking at that and how will they be evaluating it, and is there a process for escalating that if an issue should arise? And updating and user access is a huge one in schools. Not just technically, but making sure that users actually, protect their own credentials. They don't put them in that little black book in the top drawer or under the keyboard, or even a post-it note on the laptop, sellotape down a couple of times just to be sure. None of that. You need to make sure that you keep those user credentials to yourself and secure. Don't let the fear of being unprepared mean that you actually don't take the first steps to being prepared, because sometimes that means, you just can't engage with it. There's so much going on, but it is a priority. And in Derbyshire, we're absolutely thrilled to be working with the DfE and IASME on some specific sector support guidance for schools on Cyber Essentials. So you can find that at the IASME website, iasme.co.uk. That's I for Indigo, A for Alpha, S for Sierra, M for Mike, E for Echo.co.uk.
Thank you. And John, from your perspective?
There's some really, really good points that are being drawn out there, but I think one of the things that we can't state enough is the importance of the wealth of information and guidance available directly on the NCC webpage. Many, and it is to both of the points of the previous speakers, many of the very effective security controls that we see out there aren't that expensive. And that is a little bit of a myth that needs busting, that you need expensive, complex tools and, highly skilled professionals to go and deal with it. There are some real basic stuff out there, and just following those basic steps takes you to 50%, takes you to 80% of progress. And in many cases, that is the first step that most people need to go and do. Now, DFE have been working with and will continue to work with NCSC and other colleagues to try and produce that guidance, but tailor it in such a way that it's actually relevant for the education sector specific needs. But what I'd also stress, and it's probably one of the more important things here, is that whilst it's great to think about what we're doing in preventing incidents taking place, we also need to think about preparing for organisational response in the event that something does happen. It's much more effective to prepare your approach to recovery when you've got access to all these resources and you're not in that heightened stress of sort of crisis management. That is really the worst time for that sort of thought process to be taking place, because it is going to be difficult. Finally, really, sort of the final point here is just to highlight that we are producing a new self-assessment tool as part of the work that we're doing with NCSC and within the wider department to bring together many of these sort of technical measures that are being discussed here and also that are available on the NCSC webpage. Now, this will give schools the ability to assess their own security posture, and it also then allow us to then signpost the relevant material that is updated and is relevant to the current situation as well.
Thank you. I definitely agree with all of that about getting the basics right first and preparing for an incident, as that will reduce both the likelihood and the impact if it does occur. And we focus a lot on the technical sort of countermeasures for cybersecurity, but what about the non-technical measures? What would you recommend? And John, I'll let you go first this time.
Yeah, thanks. Again, it's probably the most important bit. If I'm really looking at the big picture here, it's not just about focusing on today. The shape of technology and its uses in education and society will continue to evolve, and our approach to security mustn't be seen as a one-time fix, but it's part of our investment in the future. There's strong leadership, ownership, governance is key to improving cyber resilience, and it's important that everybody is involved in cybersecurity conversation who has a stake in keeping schools and learners safe. Don't just let it be an IT problem. And specifically at this point, again, I'm pointing to the same material, but we've worked with the NCSC to pull together some key questions for school governing bodies and leadership teams to start that conversation off. If it isn't already happening, we've got some products out there which will help you kickstart that piece. But just to really, really emphasise, if we don't get it right from a leadership point of view, if we're just keeping this as a technology type problem limited within the IT space, we're not going to be able to tackle what is potentially a systemic problem, because this impacts services and outcomes, not just IT systems and computers and iPads. So links to all these resources are going to be highlighted towards the end of the session. So I would urge anybody who has any questions about this, start there and then come forward if there's more support that's needed.
Yeah, thank you. And Heather?
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to reflect on that. It's not just an IT issue and pick that up, because it's also a safeguarding issue. You've got overlaps with the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance. You've got overlaps with the Prevent Duty Counter-Terrorism Act. It's not just an IT thing. It's a governance thing. It's an attitude thing. It's an awareness thing. So making sure you've got appropriate policies in place, particularly a lot of schools have got good data protection policies now, IT security policies sitting alongside that. Do you have and do you need a bring your own device policy? Are you allowing users to come in with their own smartphones and connect, for example, to access emails? And what do you do if you allow that? Do you allow the viewing or the downloading of attachments? How do you cope with remote working, off-site working? What are the expectations on users? Are your user access protocols, your user access agreements, have they been reviewed in light of current changes in working practice? And are they actually audience specific? So if you've got children signing up for acceptable use, is it understandable? Do parents and carers know the expectations? Are they expected to read those to their children? Are they spelled out in a way that those youngsters can understand? And disaster recovery, absolutely up there. It's a sort of a hobby horse of mine. Making sure that your recovery plan is a plan. It's all very well and good having a lovely policy with lots of sub-chapters, but actually in emergency you need to pick it up. It's a step-by-step process. So test that out, make sure that somebody can do that, they can run with it very easily, and that they don't need to somehow get a translator and figure out what comes next. And don't ever underestimate the cyber risks, and make sure they're documented on your usual risk register. And those are not just risks from outside, but also internal threats or the human element, phishing emails and so on. Heard a lot about strategies, and one of the things that I've heard from schools, and we work with a lot of schools and academies, both in Derbyshire and nationally, is we've got cyber insurance. Let's make that quite clear now. Insurance is not a security strategy. It's something that you rely on in the event of disaster when all else has failed. You don't insure your home and leave your doors and windows unlocked. So I'm really excited to be working with the NCSC on some cyber resilience work specifically for schools. So lots of templates coming to a website very near you soon.
Thank you, Heather. And Steve, any last thoughts from you on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned user education earlier as one of the 10 steps to cybersecurity. And for me, this is one of the most important non-technical cybersecurity measures that we can put in place. Your users can be a really important part of your cyber defense against many of the different cybersecurity incidents, whether it be identifying a phishing attempt, not installing unknown applications, or just being really careful in the way that they access and process that data. These are all things that are really difficult for technology to prevent 100% of the time, and so education is really key. The NCSC have developed a training package aimed at school staff that will help improve staff cyber hygiene and improve the cyber resilience for school. The training covers real life scenarios that have been seen in education settings, and helps in terms of understanding the way that users can help protect those settings from cyber harm. It's available in 2 different formats. There's a self-learned video, so staff can do their own training on there, and there's a presentation slide pack for supplier technical teams or partners to be able to train school staff directly. So it should be accessible by anyone, and being able to be reviewed by anyone within the school. And members of staff can also download a certificate when they've done it. We all know that school staff like a certificate, and that's available once that training is completed to demonstrate that they've actually done the training. And again, all of those resources will be available and highlighted at the end of the webinar.
Thank you. And thank you all, panel, for joining us today. That's been really helpful and useful. I hope the viewers have found this webinar useful. And as you've all said, the links to some of the resources that have been mentioned will be put up on the screen as we're finishing. So thank you very much for joining us, and best of luck.